working on part one. As always, the module always starts with a part zero homework. This one is about weighted averages. So if you don't know how that works, I think there's a video on Canvas, or we can talk about it if you like. And then I believe our next discussion is coming up soon. And so don't forget about that. It's probably the hardest part about the discussions is just remembering to do them. So what are we up to in this module? So this module is titled Market Research on Caffeinated Products. And the idea is this: we have this startup company that wants to sell one of these products listed here. And so they sent out this survey to a bunch of people and said, okay, well, write down things like how old you are and do you think you would buy this product? And if so, how often do you think you would buy this product? Standard survey stuff. And what we're going to be doing is looking at this raw data from the survey and trying to analyze it in a way to where we can say, what the most popular product is among certain groups of people and that sort of thing. So we are looking at this giant set of raw data and just trying to come to a conclusion about what's going on there. If we look at the spreadsheet, we have 3 tabs on here. The first tab tells you what all the responses actually mean in the survey. So for example, there was a question about age and gender. And if someone put like a 1, or let's say someone put a 5 on the survey for their age, that implies they're somewhere between the ages of 46 and 55. So this tab is just sort of reminding you what these numbers mean. The next tab is a little bit more of a description about these products, not honestly super useful. Well, third tab, those where we're primarily going to be playing. So this is the raw data. And what's going on here is each one of these rows is a different person. Each one of these columns is a different question in the survey. So like here's everyone's answer to the age question. It's one of those numbers between 0 and 8 and so on. And so that is what we're analyzing. And how we're analyzing this, at least for now, is sort of 2 different ways. We're going to be using COUNTIFs function, which we've actually seen before, but I'll remind you how that works. And we're going to be using an AVERAGEIFs function as well. So at this point, I want to move over to my notes and remind you of those things. Okay, so first thing I actually want to talk about is neither of those 2 functions. It's actually a new concept called transposing. And all this is really just rotating data. And it's not 100% necessary, but the way the workbook answers the questions, it involves rotating the data first. And so it's just easier to check your work if your tables look like the tables in the book. So I wanted to show you how this works. So let's say you have this, raw data. You got people on the left, questions along the top, and you want to rotate this. I'm going to follow these steps here. You highlight the area you want to rotate. You copy it, so Command C or Control C, or you can click the little copy button up here. And instead of hitting paste, what we're going to do is click like the top left corner of where we would like this to go. Instead of this giant paste button, we're going to click the arrow underneath it. And on Windows, you're going to be looking for this icon that looks like a box being rotated. On Apple, I think it just says the word transpose. So you click that, and there we go. This guy has been rotated, and now the people are along the top instead of the side, and the questions are along the side. So I just rotated it. And this will be really helpful for comparing your work to the book. So let's say I wanted to do it with the raw data. I would highlight this whole region here, copy it. This is too big to do on the same tabs. I'm going to go to a new tab, paste it sideways, and now see how like my questions are going sideways now instead of their original orientation. So totally optional, but it'll help compare your work to the book. Okay, back to the notes. So like I mentioned, one of the first things we're going to be doing is like counting. Say, how many people said they would buy this particular product? That's a counting question. And yes, you could do this manually, but I don't want to count to 100 on my fingers. So using this function is going to be a lot easier. So let's say we have this survey, which is similar to the one we're going to be doing, where people said what their favorite color is, they said what city they live in, and they said how many kids they have. If I wanted to say I wanted to count how many people said red is their favorite color, with COUNTIFs, I highlight all of the answers for favorite color, type a comma, and then I reference this criteria cell over here for what I'm looking at. And it tells me there are 1, 2, 3, 4 people that said red is their favorite color. Okay, simple enough. But what if I want to say how many people said red is their favorite color and they live in Denver? Well, now it's sort of the same thing, but I just do more of these. So I start the exact same way, highlight all the answers to the color question. Then I click on red. I highlight all the answers to the city question, and I highlight Denver. And it counts for me that there are 3 people that said their favorite color is red and they live in Denver. Very nice. Let's do one more example. So we want COUNTIFs. I want to count how many people said these 3 responses. So highlight all those, red, highlight all those, whoops, Denver, highlight all those, and I'm looking for a 1. And all that combined tells me there was only 1 person that answered all of these things. So that's how COUNTIFs works. You can check as many criteria as you want. You just keep alternating. Range criteria, range criteria. In this case, the ranges are rows, but columns can work as well. Okay, so that's the first function I wanted to remind you of. We've technically seen this before. The next one, I don't believe we've seen this before, but it's very similar to COUNTIFs. It's called average ifs. And the reason there's an ifs on the end is because sometimes you want to average a bunch of things, but only from certain subgroups. So like I want to average only the responses from Denver, something like that. And the way we type this in, if you look at how it compares to COUNTIFs, it's the exact same format, except it has this one little extra criteria at the front. One little thing at the front, you start with, okay, which row are you averaging? So if we were typing this in, and we're doing an average ifs, and I want to average the amount of kids from people who live in Denver whose favorite color is red, I start with number of kids because that's what I'm averaging. And then I proceed by doing the exact same thing as before. Highlight all the colors, looking for red, highlight all the cities, looking for Denver, and I get an average of 2 because what it did is it singled out these 3 people and it looked at their answers, 1, 2, and 3. The average of 1, 2, and 3 is 2. So it sort of looked at this subgroup of people, the red Denver people, and it said their average number of kids is 2, instead of me having to, filter it or some sort of craziness there. There was a question in chat about if you have to click on the word externally. No, there is a way to type it into the formula, but it's much safer to do it externally because there will be questions where you are constantly changing these values and you don't want to have to jump into every single formula and change them. Okay, what else? Oh, I wanted to point this out. Because of this similarity here, we can exploit that. So let's say I do a COUNTIFs function and I highlight all the colors, I type in red, I highlight all the cities, I type in Denver. I'm going to have to do this all over again for average ifs. Well, what you can do instead is just copy this portion of the code. I just did a Control C right there. And after we get to this stage, after I get to the first comma where it's finally the same, I just paste in that code and I'm should be done, but I just messed something up. Oh, It's because I typed the wrong function name. Don't do that. So I typed average. That's why it broke. Let's start over. Average ifs, number of kids, comma. So after this first comma, and assuming you type the right function, if I paste in the rest of that code, because we've done it already, we get the same answer. So if there's going to be a lot of questions in part one where you're alternating back and forth between counting and averaging, you can use copy paste to your benefit there. That's what I wanted to point out. Okay, I want to do one more example of average ifs because this is a weird case. First of all, let's say I average all the responses to number of kids, just using the average function. You get 1.5. But sometimes you want to exclude some responses. So let's say instead of averaging all the houses in Colorado, what if I only want to average the houses with kids in them and say, okay, if you have kids, what's the average number of kids that you have? In that case, I need to ignore these people. I need to ignore these people who said 0. So what we do is we start with average ifs. Whoops. And I'm still averaging all these. So I include those people I'm going to ignore for a second. But what I'm now going to do is I'm going to highlight this again because I'm going to add a criteria on this. And so I had to do it twice, once for what I'm averaging and once for the criteria. And what's my criteria? Well, I want to ignore the zeros and only include the 1, 2s, and 3s. So I'm going to type a quote greater than 0 quote. That's how you type something directly in if it's more complicated. And that will only average the 1, 2s, and 3s. And now I get 2.14 because it's the average of all these people. And if you get rid of the zeros, your average obviously goes up. So the workbook doesn't do a good job of mentioning this, but in the survey for our module, if you see a 0, that is not a legitimate response. That's just a placeholder indicating they skipped the question. So I don't want to include any zeros in this particular module because they're not true values. If I'm looking at, okay, this person's going to buy 1 of my product, this person's going to buy 2 of my products, 0 was just someone who skipped the question. I don't want that number pulling down my average. So in the workbook, when you're doing all these counts and averaging, you need to ignore the zeros. The workbook doesn't do a great job of describing that, but that's going to be the primary criteria that you're utilizing today. And then last of all, just a couple of tips. There is a lot of repetition in this module, a lot. So take advantage of dragging and copy paste as much as you can. If you're finding yourself repeating the same steps over and over and over again, there's a better way to do it. If you can't figure it out, you can ask me. Next tip, the first 2 questions are filling out these 2 tables in the workbook. Well, what I would advise doing is instead of having like 20 at the end of the module, 20 different tables all over the place, almost make a super table, one singular table that has all these answers in it. So it's almost going to look like this, you know, if I shove them together. And that's going to make your life easier later on. And then last of all, rather, there are technically functions called COUNTIF and AVERAGEIF singular. You can use those. However, I would advise against that only because you're going to be adding more and more criteria. And so already having these plural forms, COUNTIFs, plural, AVERAGEIFs, plural, is going to help you out later. So yes, there are singular forms, but use the plurals anyway. It's going to help you out.